Anna Wood was born a slave and then freed and then betrayed and kidnapped and sold into slavery again, where she would remain enslaved for 4 years past the emancipation after the Civil War. And then she sought revenge. You see, Henrietta's parents were slaves, and so when she was born a slave. When she became a teenage girl in 1834, she was sold in slavery, eventually going to a man named William Surratt. She would be his slave for 10 years until he would abandon his wife and move from the United States back to France. The wife, Jane, became friends with Henrietta and finally took her to Ohio, a free state, to the courthouse and signed her freedom papers so that she could be a free woman. A copy of that paperwork showing that even though she was black, she was free, was given to her and another kept at the courthouse. Can you imagine what that must have felt like, to be free for the first time in your life? But it wouldn't last. You see, William's daughter, Josephine, and her husband, Robert White, were angry that she had been freed because that was money to them, their inheritance that was taken away from them. They were notoriously evil slave catchers back then who were operating under the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 to go and capture African Americans and then take them to Mississippi and sell them into the slave trade. One of them was a Kentucky deputy sheriff named Zebulon Ward, who convinced the whites to sell him the paperwork saying that Henrietta was originally a slave for $300. Zebulon Ward tracked down where Henrietta was working. She was working for a woman by the name of Rebecca Boyd. He paid Rebecca to betray Henrietta. And so Rebecca sent her on an errand into Kentucky, a slave state, and Ward and other slave traders were waiting there and captured her, tied her up, and took her to an inn. I can't imagine how terrifying that must have been for her to realize that once again she was going to be made a slave. And while at the inn, she told her story of lament to the innkeeper. And the innkeeper, he felt sorry for her. So the next day, he went down and filed a lawsuit to stop her exportation, something that she could not do herself because she was black. And also, as a black woman, she could not testify in court as to her own freedom. And so the only way to prove that she was free was with those papers, except Ward had taken the papers from them and ripped them up. So they sent to Cincinnati for the papers, but the courthouse had burnt down 4 years before. There was no record to show that she had ever been freed. And so she was sent off again in slavery. She ended up being sold this time to a man named Jared Brandon, who was an incredibly rich slaveholder. He owned 800 slaves. And at the end of the Civil War, he sought to keep those slaves by taking them out of Mississippi and into Texas, because Texas was a haven for racist slave owners. They all went there and dared the U.S. government to come in and to stop them. It would take until Juneteenth, 1865, for the U.S. Army to come to Texas to end this practice. But they did not free Henrietta. She remained a slave to Brandon until he went back to Mississippi to do some things, brought her with, and she was able to find her freedom. But what was she supposed to do? So Brandon said that if he would remain in his employ, he would pay her $10 a month. But of course, he never did. Finally, 4 years later, she would escape to Kentucky to her family, where she would find a lawyer. His name was Harvey Myers, and he took a case that nobody thought he could win. He took Henrietta's case and told her that he was going to get justice. And so he stood in front of a jury of 12 white men, and he argued that she should get reparations for what was done to her. The judge was unhappy with this argument and pointed out that the jury should not consider the morality of slavery in coming to its decision, and instead should treat this not as a slavery case, but as a simple kidnapping case. Henrietta asked for $20,000 in reparation. The jury gave her $2,500. Today, that would be $65,000 for 13 years of enslavement. A horribly inadequate amount, and yet it remains the largest reparations award ever in U.S. history.